The world awoke to a headline that seemed ripped from the pages of a political thriller. Be ready for battle. Venezuela declares war on the United States. In Caracas, Nicolás Maduro's voice thundered through state television, his fist raised high, his words sharp as steel. The empire thinks it can intimidate us with warships, but Venezuela will never kneel. The crowd roared in response, red flags waving, fists pounding against the humid night air. But thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., the response wasn't thunder. It was silence. The cold silence of a superpower moving pieces across a chessboard. A U.S. Navy fleet was already gliding through Caribbean waters, steel giants cutting through waves, each one carrying a message louder than any speech. America is watching. Two nations now stood eye to eye. On one side, a government, clinging to power, rallying militias, promising to bleed for sovereignty. On the other, a president whose every move was calculated to project dominance, resolve, and American strength. The air was electric. Ordinary Venezuelans whispered in fear. Would their streets soon echo with gunfire? In Miami, Venezuelan exiles watched the news with trembling hands, their families still trapped back home. On social media, hashtags began to trend before dawn. One trade. Hands off Venezuela. Trump vs. Maduro. And for the first time in years, the world remembered just how fragile peace really was. This was not just another diplomatic scuffle. This was something darker, sharper, closer to the abyss. A moment where a single word, or a single miscalculated move, could ignite a firestorm. The stage was set. The villain had spoken with fury. The hero had answered with silence. A silence that carried more weight than any insult. But here's the question that left every American, every Venezuelan, every global observer holding their breath. Was this just posturing, or was the world truly on the brink of war, because what happened next would shake not only two nations, but the very idea of freedom itself? The declaration of war was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of months, even years, of tightening pressure, bruised egos, and political theater played out on the global stage. To understand why this moment mattered, we need to zoom out. Venezuela, once one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America thanks to its vast oil reserves, had become a nation gasping for air. Under Nicolás Maduro's rule, corruption had hollowed out its economy. Hyperinflation devoured salaries. Food shortages left supermarket shelves bare. Millions of Venezuelans fled across borders, desperate for survival. For Washington, this collapse was more than just a foreign tragedy. It was a test of American influence in its own hemisphere. The United States had long declared itself the protector of democracy in the Americas. But here was a dictator clinging to power, defying sanctions, mocking international pressure, and now, openly threatening war. Donald Trump, never one to back down from confrontation, ordered U.S. Navy warships into the Caribbean in a show of force. Officially, the move was described as an anti-narcotics operation. But everyone knew the symbolism. These were not fishing boats. These were billion-dollar machines of war, cruising just off Venezuela's coast, gleaming in the sunlight like silent predators. Maduro, cornered and furious, played his part with fiery defiance. On national TV, he donned military fatigues and rallied militias he called the People's Army. Men and women marched through Caracas holding rifles, chanting loyalty to their commander. It was a carefully staged display. The image of a leader standing against imperialism, even as his people starved. For Venezuelan families, it was a nightmare. To them, the U.S. warships did not feel like symbols. They felt like shadows of a possible invasion. Mothers worried about sons drafted into militias. Fathers feared bombs raining down on cities already battered by poverty. Students, activists, exiles, All wondered if their homeland was about to become the next battleground of great power politics. And yet, for Trump's supporters, the warships were a message of strength. America will not be pushed around. For critics, it was reckless saber-rattling, another step toward a conflict that could spiral out of control. The stakes had risen far beyond sanctions and speeches. This was now a collision course between two leaders unwilling to blink, a dictator clinging to his throne, a U.S. president seeking to project dominance, and caught in the middle, ordinary people who had no say in the theater of war being staged above their heads. But here's what made this moment even more dangerous. Both sides believed they could win. Maduro, betting on nationalist pride and the image of defiance. Trump, betting on military might and America's unmatched arsenal. Two men, two nations, two visions of power. And only one could emerge without losing face. The world held its breath, waiting for the next move. Because the confrontation was no longer about oil or sanctions or even narcotics. It was about dignity. It was about survival. And it was about to escalate in ways nobody could have imagined. Every great conflict has a villain, and in this drama, that role was embodied by Nicolás Maduro, a man who rose from the shadows of Hugo Chávez's revolution and transformed himself into one of the most controversial figures on the global stage. To his supporters, Maduro presented himself as the protector of Chávez's legacy, the defender of socialism, the man who would resist the so-called Yankee Empire. But to his critics, and there were many, he was the embodiment of arrogance, corruption, and hypocrisy. Maduro was not born a soldier. He was a bus driver, a union organizer, a man who climbed the ranks not through brilliance, but through loyalty. Loyalty to Chávez, loyalty to the party, loyalty to the cult of revolution. And when Chávez's health failed, it was Maduro who was handpicked as successor. Not because he was the most capable, but because he was the most loyal. At first, he wore Chávez's memory like a shield. He invoked the name Comandante in every speech, framing himself as the chosen heir. But over time, the mask slipped. Beneath the rhetoric of socialism and equality, Venezuela's democracy withered. Opposition parties were silenced. Journalists disappeared. Protesters were met with rubber bullets, then tear gas, then live rounds. The nation's oil wealth, once the engine of prosperity, became a feeding trough for insiders and cronies. Billions vanished. Meanwhile, children went to bed hungry, hospitals ran out of medicine, and families scavenged through trash bags for food. And yet Maduro stood on stages draped in red banners, proclaiming himself the champion of the people. He paraded through military ranks, chest puffed, claiming to be the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty against foreign imperialists. The contradiction was glaring. A man who starved his own people while feasting on rhetoric of pride. International observers watched as election after election descended into farce. Ballot boxes stuffed, opponents banned, courts rigged. By 2018, Maduro declared victory in an election that many countries called fraudulent. But in his narrative, it wasn't fraud. It was destiny. He was Venezuela's rightful leader, chosen to resist foreign plots. Then came the sanctions. The United States, the European Union, and dozens of countries sought to choke off Maduro's power by targeting oil exports and freezing assets. Instead of backing down, Maduro doubled down. He turned the pressure into propaganda. "Look," he declared to crowds, "this suffering is not my doing. It is theirs, the empire, the outsiders, the Yankees who want to crush us." And the more the sanctions bit, the more desperate he became to prove strength. He mobilized militias. He handed out rifles. He called them the Bolivarian Defense Forces. Ordinary citizens turned into soldiers, trained not with resources but with ideology. In his speeches, he promised they would defend every street, every corner, every stone of Venezuela from foreign boots. But underneath the bluster lay fear. Fear of being toppled. Fear of exile. Fear of justice. For Maduro knew what awaited deposed dictators. He had seen the images. Saddam dragged from a hole. Gaddafi cornered in the desert. He understood that once power slipped from his fingers, there would be no hiding place, so he clung tighter. He silenced harder. He armed more desperately. The villain was not strong because of his righteousness. He was strong because he was cornered, and cornered men fight the fiercest. And that is what made him so dangerous, because a villain who has nothing to lose will gamble everything. And when Trump's warships appeared on the horizon, Maduro made his gamble. He declared war, not because Venezuela could truly match American might, but because his pride, his image, and his survival depended on it. This was not just the story of a leader defending his nation. It was the story of a man trying to protect his throne. A man willing to drag an entire country into chaos, if only to preserve his image as the unbroken, unbending champion of revolution. And so, the villain had made his move. But in every great story, when the villain rises, so too must the hero. And the hero's story is where this battle truly begins. Every story of tyranny demands its counterweight. The voice of dignity, the symbol of resistance, the embodiment of calm strength in the face of arrogance. In this drama, the hero is not just a single man or a single government. The hero is layered, America projecting itself as the defender of democracy, and the millions of ordinary Venezuelans whose dignity refused to be erased. To understand why the clash mattered, we need to look at the people behind the headlines. In Venezuela's streets, there were students who carried nothing but banners and chants, facing off against riot police with shields and rubber bullets. There were mothers who rationed food, skipping meals so their children could eat. There were doctors who performed surgeries with broken equipment, fighting to save lives even when hospitals had no power. These were the faces of resilience. They were the living reminder that dignity does not crumble under dictatorship. And in the United States, there was another story running parallel. America had long framed itself as the guardian of democracy in the Western Hemisphere. From the Monroe Doctrine to Cold War standoffs, Washington always claimed responsibility for protecting its backyard. But in this moment, with Maduro raging and militias marching, America's identity as a global leader was on trial. Enter Donald Trump, brash, bold, unafraid of confrontation. To his critics, he was reckless. To his supporters, he was decisive. But one thing was certain. He would not allow Maduro's declaration of defiance to pass unanswered. In the American narrative, this wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about strength, about proving that the world's most powerful nation would never be humiliated by a dictator clinging to survival. Yet the real heartbeat of the hero's story came not from political theater in Washington, but from Venezuelan voices themselves. From Juan Guaidó, the young opposition leader who dared to stand against Maduro, declaring himself interim president in 2019. From exiles in Miami who flooded social media with videos of protests back home, amplifying the cries of their people. From journalists who risked arrest to broadcast the truth. They became symbols, not of weakness, but of unyielding spirit. They had no warships, they had no militias, but they had courage. And courage, when amplified, can rival any weapon. The contrast could not be sharper. On one side, Maduro in military fatigues, shouting into microphones, surrounding himself with soldiers and staged parades. On the other, a grandmother in Caracas who cooked one meal a day from scraps but still whispered, "Prayers for freedom." Who truly held power in that image? The dictator with his rifles? Or the ordinary citizen who refused to let her dignity be stolen? America saw in these people a reflection of its own ideals: liberty, resilience, defiance in the face of tyranny. That is why Trump, for all his controversies, seized the chance to cast the United States as the hero in this unfolding drama. Deploying warships was not simply a flex of muscle. It was a statement. The free world will not bow. But unlike Maduro, who clung to rage, the hero's resolve was rooted in calm. America did not shout. America moved quietly, deliberately, sending a message through presence rather than bombast. Warships gliding across the Caribbean spoke louder than insults ever could. This calm resolve unsettled Maduro more than threats ever would. For dictators thrive on noise, on chaos, on fiery confrontation. Silence, steady, composed, unblinking. Silence forces them to confront their own weakness. And this is what made the hero archetype so powerful. It was not a single face, not a single speech, but a collective narrative. The exiled Venezuelan family longing for return. The American sailor aboard a ship watching the horizon, knowing history was unfolding. The activist holding a sign in Caracas that simply read, Libertad. Together, these stories braided into one powerful truth. Dignity always finds a way to speak, even when a tyrant tries to silence it. And as the world braced for confrontation, it became clear. This was more than a geopolitical standoff. It was a test of values. Would arrogance crush dignity? Would bluster defeat calm? Would fear overwhelm freedom? The hero's backstory of resilience, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve set the stage for the battle to come. And when villain and hero finally collided, the clash would be more than military. It would be moral. But before that collision came the first sparks, the escalating war of words, and those sparks were about to ignite. The stage was set. The villain had roared. The hero had stood firm. And now came the clash of words. The opening volleys of a conflict that was as much about perception as it was about power. Maduro wasted no time. Standing before rows of uniformed soldiers, he shouted into the cameras, "Let them come! Venezuela does not fear war. We will bury the empire in the Caribbean Sea." His voice trembled not with fear, but with desperation disguised as bravado. His generals clapped, his militia cheered. But behind the spectacle lay unease. They knew what their leader dared not admit. This was David taunting Goliath without a slingshot. In Washington, the response was colder, sharper, and infinitely more unnerving. Donald Trump did not scream. He did not pace the stage. He spoke with the tone of a man who knew the weight of the arsenal behind him. "We will not allow narco-dictators to threaten our hemisphere. Our forces are ready. Our allies are watching. And our patience has limits." The contrast was cinematic. One side drowning in noise and fury, the other radiating silence and control. One side clutching rifles in ragtag militias, the other deploying billion-dollar destroyers with quiet precision. And yet the words themselves became weapons. In Caracas, Maduro painted Trump as the villain. A foreign tyrant, a capitalist monster, a threat to the sovereignty of Latin America. He declared the mobilization of 2 million citizen soldiers, parading them through the streets with painted rifles and chants of Patria o muerte, homeland or death. In Washington, Trump painted Maduro as the villain, a thug who starves his people, steals their future, and clings to power through corruption and fear. His words echoed across American cable news, through think tank panels, into dinner table debates. Each word was calibrated to cut, to provoke, to draw the other closer to the brink. Meanwhile, the world watched in dread. Latin American neighbors feared refugees flooding across their borders. European allies urged restraint, but braced for markets to shake. Social media platforms exploded with debates. Was Trump defending democracy or risking global conflict? Was Maduro a hero of sovereignty or a dictator dragging his people into ruin? For ordinary Venezuelans, The war of words felt heavier than bombs. Each headline deepened uncertainty. Would warships fire? Would militias march? Would their country survive the week? And in this escalating verbal duel, something remarkable became clear. One man was rattled, one was not. Maduro's speeches grew louder, his gestures wilder, his promises more impossible. He vowed that every mountain, every valley, every barrio would resist the invaders. Yet his voice cracked under the strain of holding back fear. Trump, by contrast, grew quieter, his statements shorter, his tone steadier. He let the weight of America's presence do the speaking. The silence of a carrier group on the horizon was worth more than 10,000 shouted threats. The escalation had begun. The villain was trembling louder. The hero was standing calmer. And as words burned hotter, the world waited for the moment when silence would break. The moment when the hero would finally strike back with proof, with power, with a counterattack so sharp it would leave the villain's mask in pieces. That moment was coming, and it would change everything. The tension was unbearable. Caracas streets buzzed with whispers. Some said U.S. warships were preparing for a strike. Others swore Venezuelan militias were plotting to hit first. Every rumor carried the same question: how close are we to war? In Washington, cameras zoomed in on Trump as he leaned into the microphone, promising swift action if Maduro dared to cross the line. In Caracas, Maduro raised his fist and roared, "Let them come!" But here's the chilling truth. History has taught us that wars don't always begin with missiles or tanks. Sometimes they begin with a single phrase, a careless boast, a slip of arrogance that sparks a fire no one can put out. And as both leaders grew louder, their words became weapons. Sharper, more dangerous than bullets. The world waited, breathless. Analysts asked, would Trump risk another foreign conflict in an election year? Would Maduro gamble the last of his power on a fight he couldn't win? It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, listening to rocks crack beneath your feet, knowing the fall was coming but not knowing who would jump first. And then, the silence shattered. One voice, unexpected, raw, undeniable, cut through the noise and flipped the story upside down. The tension had reached its breaking point. For days the world had listened to Nicolás Maduro's furious speeches, watched his parades of ragtag militias, and heard his promises of homeland or death. His voice filled the air with fury, but his words carried the unmistakable scent of desperation. And then, silence. The silence of warships cutting through the Caribbean at dawn. The silence of American submarines gliding just beneath the waves, invisible but lethal. The silence of the world's most powerful military drawing a red circle around Venezuela without firing a single shot. It was in that silence that the counterattack began. Trump stepped before the cameras in the White House press room, flanked by flags, the seal of the presidency shining above his shoulder. He did not shout. He did not wave his fists. Instead, he leaned forward into the microphone and spoke with cold clarity. Nicolás Maduro has declared war on the United States. But let me be clear. This is not a war between equals. This is not a battle between armies. This is a tragedy of a dictator who has betrayed his people, stolen their future, and now hides behind false cries of sovereignty. America does not fear his threats. We stand with the people of Venezuela. The words echoed like cannon fire across the globe. In Miami, Venezuelan exiles wept in front of their television screens, tweeting furiously under the hashtag #ShyFreeVenezuela. In Caracas, citizens watched in hushed disbelief from flickering screens, hearing for the first time a voice that separated them from their dictator. Trump wasn't declaring war on Venezuela. He was declaring war on Maduro. And then came the proof. The Pentagon released images, satellite photos of drug smuggling routes allegedly tied to Maduro's inner circle. intelligence documents outlining billions siphoned from Venezuela's oil industry into secret accounts, testimonies from defected generals describing corruption, torture, and betrayal at the highest levels. The world gasped. Maduro, who had painted himself as the defender of the people, was unmasked as a profiteer of their suffering. His fiery speeches now rang hollow, his chants of sovereignty reduced to the whimper of a man caught red-handed. Crowds erupted. In Venezuela's barrios, whispers turned to shouts. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Maduro exposed. Justice for Venezuela. The lies are over. But the mic drop moment had not yet reached its crescendo. Because alongside the accusations came something even more powerful: hope. Trump announced a package of humanitarian aid to be delivered not through Maduro's government, but through international organizations. Food, medicine, and supplies were promised directly to the people. "We will not punish Venezuelans for the crimes of their dictator," Trump declared. "We will stand with them until Venezuela is free." It was a masterstroke, the kind of move that flipped the narrative overnight. No longer was this a standoff between two egos. Now it was a moral confrontation between dignity and tyranny, compassion and corruption. Maduro's reaction was immediate, furious. He pounded his fist on a podium, calling the evidence lies fabricated by imperialists. He accused defectors of betrayal, accused America of meddling, accused anyone and everyone but himself. But his voice cracked, his words stumbled, his confidence wavered, and the world saw it. They saw the villain's armor dented, his image faltering, his power slipping. Meanwhile, the hero stood calm. America did not raise its voice. It let facts, proof, and compassion deliver the blow. It let silence and overwhelming strength rattle the dictator louder than any scream. Social media became a battlefield of its own. Clips of Trump's speech went viral, spliced with images of starving Venezuelan families, overlaid with captions like, "Maduro feasts, Venezuela starves." Memes mocked the dictator's fiery threats against U.S. warships. Late-night comedians parodied his speeches. Influencers and activists alike declared the turning point had arrived, and for Venezuelans who had lived for years under fear, this moment was electric. For once, they saw their dictator shaken. For once, they saw him cornered not by militias or tanks, but by truth. The mic drop was complete. The villain's mask had cracked. The world was watching. And for the first time, the balance of the drama shifted. But the most remarkable part of this counterattack wasn't the speech, or the evidence, or even the aid. It was the calm resolve behind it. Maduro had declared war with fire. America had answered with silence, proof, and dignity. The contrast could not have been sharper. The villain screamed. The hero whispered. And the whisper carried farther than the scream ever could. Yet even as the world cheered the takedown, a chilling question lingered. If Maduro was truly cornered, how would he respond? Would he crumble under the weight of truth? Or would a cornered man with nothing left to lose drag his nation deeper into chaos? Because history had shown one undeniable truth. Villains fight hardest when they know the end is near, and what came next would send shockwaves across continents. The counterattack had landed like a thunderclap. One speech, one release of evidence, one promise of aid. And suddenly the ground beneath Maduro's feet began to shake. But the true impact of the moment was not measured in military maneuvers or diplomatic cables. It was measured in the roar of the world reacting all at once. Social media erupted within minutes. Hashtags blazed across Twitter and Instagram. Maduro exposed. Venezuela libre. Empire of truth. Clips of Trump's calm statement were spliced with images of emaciated children, lines of families waiting hours for bread, and streets flooded with protesters. In less than 24 hours, Millions of shares had turned a political speech into a cultural earthquake. In Caracas, graffiti began to appear overnight on crumbling walls. Maduro mentiroso, Maduro the liar. University students projected slogans onto government buildings, their defiance amplified by viral videos. Exiles in Miami organized marches, waving both Venezuelan and American flags, chanting, "Justice now! Freedom now!" The international community weighed in with astonishing speed. European leaders condemned Maduro's corruption. Latin American presidents, some of whom had remained cautious, began to shift their tone. Even nations that once supported Maduro publicly distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged down with a crumbling regime. News anchors around the globe replayed the mic drop moment on loop. Commentators debated whether this was Trump's most decisive foreign policy move, while others warned of escalation. But one thing was undeniable. The villain had been unmasked before a global audience, and the mask could never be put back on. Celebrities added fuel to the fire. Pop stars with millions of followers tweeted in solidarity with Venezuelans. Athletes posted emotional videos calling for dignity and justice. Influencers shared clips of Venezuelan children receiving food from aid groups, contrasting it with Maduro's lavish banquets. Each share, each post, each reaction became another nail in the coffin of his image. And inside Venezuela, whispers of hope spread like wildfire. For years, despair had suffocated the nation. But now, people began to speak of possibility. Could this really be the beginning of the end? Could the dictator who once seemed untouchable finally be cracking? But shockwaves do not only bring hope, they also bring danger. Maduro, furious at the exposure, lashed out. His government arrested journalists accused of spreading imperialist lies. Militias patrolled the streets more aggressively. Opposition leaders went into hiding. The villain's desperation deepened, and with it, the risk to ordinary Venezuelans grew. Yet repression only amplified the reaction. Every arrest sparked outrage online. Every act of censorship created new martyrs. Every crackdown fueled the narrative that Maduro was not a defender of sovereignty, but a dictator terrified of truth. Meanwhile, Washington doubled down. American officials appeared on every major network, reinforcing the narrative that this was not about invading Venezuela, but liberating it. "Our fight is not with the Venezuelan people," one official declared. "It is with one man, and one man only." The framing worked. Public opinion, both at home and abroad, increasingly sided with the hero. For once, Americans saw themselves not as aggressors, but as protectors of democracy. And Venezuelans saw hope reflector. Shockwaves rolled outward. In cafes, in barrios, in embassies, people debated what would happen next. Was Maduro finished? Would he cling to power until the bitter end? Would the U.S. escalate further? One thing was clear. The balance of perception had shifted. The villain's voice, once booming across stages, now sounded hollow. The hero's resolve, once doubted, now seemed unshakable. And yet, beneath the noise of tweets and headlines, a darker current flowed. For every cheer, there was a question. For every post of solidarity, a fear. Because cornered villains rarely surrender quietly. And as the shockwaves spread, the world braced for the dictator's next move. A move that could either cement his downfall or plunge the hemisphere into chaos. When the noise of speeches and the roar of hashtags began to fade, something larger emerged from the chaos. Beneath the bluster of a dictator and the silence of warships, beneath the threats and the counterattacks, the story revealed itself for what it truly was. Not just a clash of nations, but a test of values. For what was really at stake here? It wasn't just oil reserves or geopolitical influence. It wasn't just a military chess game in the Caribbean. At its core, this confrontation asked one simple question. Does dignity still matter in our world? Maduro had tried to weaponize fear. He brandished rifles, shouted about sovereignty, painted himself as the eternal defender of Venezuela. But in doing so, he revealed something deeper. His rule was built not on love, not on respect, but on control. Fear was his currency. Silence was his weapon. And yet, dignity cannot be silenced forever. It rises in the chants of students who march despite tear gas. It glows in the quiet resilience of mothers who share their last piece of bread with their children. It resounds in the calm of a nation that does not scream back at threats, but answers with truth. That was the moral heartbeat of the drama. Dignity versus arrogance. Calm resolve versus desperate bluster. Freedom versus fear. The lesson was clear. Weapons may win battles, but values win wars. Maduro's war of words collapsed the moment the world saw his corruption laid bare. His parades of militias crumbled under the weight of truth. His defiance, once framed as sovereignty, was exposed as selfishness. And on the other side, the hero's strength was not in missiles or warships, though those loomed large, but in restraint, in the ability to hold silence, to wield evidence, to pair power with compassion. That is what gave the counterattack its force. That is why it echoed across the globe. For audiences watching, whether in Caracas, Washington, or beyond, the story became more than news. It became a parable, a reminder that tyrants fall not because they are shouted down, but because they are unmasked. That dignity endures not because it is loud, but because it is unbreakable. And in that universal lesson lies hope. Hope that Venezuela, scarred but unbowed, will find its path back to freedom. Hope that America, imperfect yet resolute, will remember that its greatest strength is not dominance, but the ability to inspire. Hope that every individual watching, no matter their nation, can carry forward the truth that arrogance fades, but dignity lasts. The battle may not have ended in a single day. The villain may not have surrendered overnight, but the confrontation left behind a truth larger than Maduro or Trump, larger than Venezuela or the United States. It reminded the world that in the end, dictatorships do not collapse because armies invade. They collapse because the people rise, because the truth spreads, because dignity refuses to die. And that truth is the real victory. So, what began with a single warship in the Caribbean escalated into something much greater. A war not of missiles, but of truth versus lies. A clash not just between Washington and Caracas, but between dignity and arrogance, hope and fear, freedom and control. History will remember this moment not for the bluster of Maduro's threats, but for the unmasking of his corruption, not for the rattling of weapons, but for the quiet force of truth that spread from newsrooms to living rooms, from protests on the streets to trending hashtags online. And now the question is no longer just about Venezuela. It's about us, all of us. Will we stay silent when arrogance rises? Or will we remember that truth, once spoken, can ripple across nations? Will we retreat into cynicism? Or will we stand in the belief that dignity, no matter how buried, no matter how attacked, always finds a way back into the light? Because make no mistake, this was not just their battle. It is ours too. It is the battle of every immigrant who refuses to give up their dream, of every parent who sacrifices for their children, of every citizen who demands that power be accountable to the people, not the other way around. And if you believe in that battle, if you believe that dignity is stronger than fear, that truth is louder than lies, that freedom is worth fighting for, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of a movement that refuses to bow. Because as long as there are voices willing to speak, tyrants will tremble. And as long as dignity endures, freedom will never die. The war of words between Washington and Caracas did not stay confined to the Americas. Within hours of Trump's warship announcement and Maduro's fiery declaration of war, the world itself became a stage, and every major power rushed to take their place. In Moscow, a spokesperson smirked before cameras. "The United States cannot simply bully its way into Venezuela. Russia will not stand idly by." For the Kremlin, Venezuela was not just a distant ally. It was a foothold in America's own backyard. Russian oil companies, Russian weapons, Russian advisors, all had quietly flowed into Caracas for years. This wasn't just about ideology. It was about leverage. Every American move in Ukraine or Syria could now be countered with a chess piece in South America. In Beijing, the reaction was more subtle, but no less calculated. China had invested billions into Venezuela's oil industry, securing long-terms contracts that tied Caracas to Beijing's economic vision. A destabilized Venezuela threatened China's access to resources, and so, with words carefully chosen, Chinese officials condemned the U.S. deployment as an act of provocation that undermines peace. Behind closed doors, Beijing strategists whispered of something larger. If America was distracted in its own hemisphere, the Pacific would be theirs to dominate. Cuba, Venezuela's closest ideological ally, wasted no time. Havana declared Maduro a brother in arms, promising to resist Yankee imperialism, just as Fidel once had. Cuban advisors, long embedded within Venezuela's intelligence apparatus, braced themselves for what they believed could be a modern-day Bay of Pigs, a test of wills between revolution and empire. And then came the oil producers, OPEC states, calculating the impact of sanctions and blockades. Every missile, every ship, every threat in the Caribbean meant volatility in global markets. The price of crude flickered like a heartbeat. Nations thousands of miles away suddenly realized their economies might rise or collapse on the outcome of this standoff, but perhaps most telling of all were America's own allies. Europe spoke with caution, condemning Maduro's brutality while also warning Washington against escalation. Some NATO partners feared that a war in South America would stretch the alliance too thin. Others, quietly, worried about refugees, trade, disruptions, and the haunting possibility that U.S. bravado might drag them into yet another open-ended conflict. On social media, the battle lines were drawn even faster. Hashtags ignited like sparks. One, hands off Venezuela from one side, one, freedom for Venezuela from the other. Influencers, activists, and world leaders flooded the digital battlefield, each tweet another bullet in the war for perception. For millions scrolling on their phones, this wasn't just a policy debate. It was an existential choice: empire or liberation, dignity or domination. Yet beneath all the noise, one truth became clear. This was never just a clash between Maduro and Trump. It was a global power struggle where every rival power had something to gain, and every ally had something to lose. The Caribbean was no longer just blue waters and trade routes. It was a chessboard, and Venezuela was the pawn that could trigger a checkmate heard around the world. But while nations schemed in conference rooms and headlines screamed across the globe, something deeper was happening inside Venezuela itself. Away from the cameras, away from the declarations of war. Something that could prove even more decisive than warships or sanctions. Because as governments fought their shadow games, the Venezuelan people were finding their voice. And what they did next would shake both Caracas and Washington to their core. While Maduro thundered about resistance and foreign leaders postured for influence, ordinary Venezuelans faced a simpler, harsher reality. Survival. In crumbling neighborhoods of Caracas, in villages stretched thin by scarcity, in classrooms where teachers tried to teach children too hungry to focus. Warships meant nothing compared to empty shelves and vanishing medicine. Yet it was precisely in this despair that a new defiance began to bloom. In hushed conversations whispered over dimly lit kitchens, Families asked the question no dictatorship can endure. How much longer? Students painted slogans on walls under the cover of night. Libertad. No más hambre. Workers carried homemade signs into the streets, risking tear gas and rubber bullets to declare that the regime no longer spoke for them. Social media became the underground press of a nation held hostage. Videos of police brutality, of military trucks blocking aid, of children collapsing from hunger, all spread faster than state censors could erase them. And with each post, each viral clip, Venezuelans discovered that they were not isolated voices in the dark. They were part of a chorus, swelling louder by the day. Mothers carried pots and pans into protests, banging them in a deafening rhythm of defiance. Doctors formed human chains outside hospitals, demanding access to supplies. Even soldiers, once loyal to Maduro, began to defect, some slipping across borders, others openly refusing orders. Each act, however small, chipped away at the facade of invincibility that the regime clung to. But there was something even more powerful than defiance at work. It was hope. The hope that came when Venezuelans saw their struggle echoed around the world. The hope that surged when a hashtag they started trended globally. The hope that lit their hearts when they realized they were not just victims of a dictator, but symbols of a universal truth. Dignity cannot be crushed. Yes, Maduro still controlled the guns, the media, the military. Yes, the U.S. still flexed its muscle with warships and sanctions. But history has never been written solely by presidents or generals. It has always, ultimately, been written by people. And inside Venezuela, the people were beginning to write their own chapter. And so, in the streets of Caracas and the barrios of Maracaibo, in digital spaces that the regime could not silence, in the chants of children and the courage of grandparents, the real battle was taking shape. Not a battle of warships, but of wills. Not a battle of armies, but of voices. And though the world watched the leaders, it would soon learn the same lesson again. Power is temporary, but people endure. And it was this endurance, this rising chorus of the people's voice, that would transform a moment of tension into a movement for liberation. A story not of war, but of awakening.